So interesting. People made hair into jewellery. So interesting. To my mind, curly hair does not represent the phallus. I did this dissertation. Hair's a bit funky. Certain colours of hair have been studied more than others. This dissertation, so weird, I cannot tell you. So it's like a dangerous beauty. It gets a bit disgusting, it gets a bit gruesome at times. Love and sexuality and death. Oh, interesting. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Hello, 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 hello. I graduated from Cambridge over a year ago now, which is mad to think about, like actually crazy. I have a full adult job and that's really exciting. I get to write for a living, which is a dream. But you know what, even though like I write so much all the time now and it's like literally professional articles, journalism, like that I'm really, really proud of. One of the pieces of work that I'm still proudest of most in the whole entire world is my dissertation that I wrote at Cambridge. It's this bad boy. I began it in the summer of 2020 and I finished writing it in the new year of 2021. So that's still ages ago, like that's a year and a half ago, which is mental. I was supervised by someone called Dr. Elizabeth Foister, who was like the loveliest lady in the world. She was also really cool because she'd just been the historical advisor on the 2020 film Emma with Anya Taylor-Joy, and she'd like done all of this like film stuff, and she was just really cool and like so lovely. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my beautiful baby, my first child. A cultural history of female hair in 19th century Britain. Also, heads up, this is going to be a little bit of like a narcissistic indulgence because I am super proud of this and I'm not going to shut up about how proud I am of it. So I'm not going to dull my glow. You're just going to have to deal with it, okay? Thanks. It's 15,000 words long. I mean, for goodness sake, this contents page, it's like contents page porn. Like, it's all like, have you ever seen a better contents page? Thank you. No. An 11-page bibliography with so many sources. I used newspapers, I used magazines, I used medical texts, I used adverts, novels, poems, paintings, and items from the British Museum, as well as quite a lot of secondary sources too. So I did my research. You know when you do something and you're just like, I poured so much hard work and effort into this, like I want more people to know about it. I want it to be for something. Like I found it so interesting and like so exciting to learn all of this stuff and to put it into words that it's just like, I want this research to matter and for more people to have access to it because it's interesting. So I'm making videos about it. And I really hope that you find it interesting too. This video is just going to be about the introduction. So I'm literally just going to go through what I wrote in the introduction. And maybe some more videos will be coming, delving a little bit deeper into the chapters. Who knows? I'll see the reaction that this video gets. And if you don't like it, then maybe I won't. Or maybe I'll do it anyway, because this is my channel, okay? It's a history channel. And this is history, and this is good history. It's not just good history that is interesting, it's good history that I did the research. I played the historian for this one, and there are so many interesting pictures, and it's about women as well, which I love, and it's in the 19th century. I mean, come on, Victorian hair. So, oh. And it's a really, really interesting topic as well because hair is so powerful because it's so closely embedded to ideas of the self. It's moldable, changeable, and you can alter it according to fashion and according to your own identity and your own expression. And then also it's like tied to you, like your biological self, your inherited genes, your body. So it has like both of these elements of selfhood, the active social self and the inherited biological self, like coming into one, and so it's so like powerful. And hair as a thing, as a substance, gains or loses value based on the person it represents as well. So some could even think that because it's so related to the self and so powerful, maybe it like goes beyond historicization, like maybe we shouldn't think about it in a really historical way. But the way that we've thought about hair has changed through time. So it is very historical. You can historicise it, and that is what I did. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what I did. Because hair's connection to the self, and therefore the power of hair and the meaning that people attributed to hair, was especially powerful in the 19th century, in my opinion, after all the research that I've done. People viewed it, I argue, as a window into the soul. So like who you are as a person, to the extent that like the colour and texture and style of hair could be interpreted in like a code, like a hirsute, that means hair, a hirsute code that was used really consistently across lots of different art forms and literature, and also like in the public imagination. And that's so interesting, so interesting. And also when it was cut off as detached locks of hair, it came to represent the person whose hair it was. And in the 19th century, it sort of replaced them sometimes. People exchanged their hair as like symbols for themselves and each other. Like, it was crafted into jewellery. Like people made hair into jewellery and then would give it to each other and like would treasure these bits of hair as if they represented or were the other person that had given it to them, whose hair it was, because it was literally that other person. Like it's literally a part of their body, and then it's also been like crafted potentially and moulded into this beautiful object. So it's so interesting in that respect, especially when that lock of hair had come from someone who died. Like that was incredibly powerful, and hair was often exchanged after death. So interesting, so interesting. Why did hair in the 19th century take on this new power, this new significance? Well, in the 18th century, wigs were all the rage. And that stopped being the case in the 1790s. So just before the beginning of the 19th century, people stopped routinely wearing wigs, which meant that in the 19th century, people could newly assume that what they saw as the hair on someone's head was that person's hair, was that person. I mean, this is mainly a transition that happened in the high society and like in upper echelons of society and upper circles. But now across the board, hair was more personal because it was assumed to be the wearer's rather than something they'd purchased, rather than a wig. So now hair was uncovered. And that's especially important because in the 19th century, most of a woman was covered most of the time. So there's this historian called Galia Offek who was hugely important in my dissertation. She wrote a really, really interesting book that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But she made the really interesting observation that during the daytime, hair was almost the only exposed, visible, distinctly feminine part of a woman's appearance. So it was infused with what she called an overdetermination of sexual meaning. Just day to day, a woman would cover herself in her clothing all the way down to her ankles and her feet. She'd be completely covered all the way up to here. During daytime, she'd be covered pretty much up to her neck and down to her wrists. Like, sure, in the evenings she might be a little bit cheeky, but, you know, during the daytime, her hair was pretty much the only thing that was exposed that was distinctly feminine and that was hers and her body part apart from her face. So it became more of a signifier of femininity. She talks about an overdetermination of sexual meaning. So hair was sexual, and this was particularly the case in the 19th century due to changing conceptualizations of gender and sexuality. So there's this historian called Thomas Lacker, very important historian when it comes to gender in this era. So he said that the 18th century saw the transition from what he calls a one-body model of gender to a two-body model of gender. And I've talked about this before in my videos, but it basically means that men and women were previously seen as variants of one spectrum of human experience. But by the 19th century, they were thought of as different in every conceivable aspect of body and soul. This was partially because they'd made some new discoveries about male and female reproductive systems, what they thought were just inverted versions of the same thing. They now realised were completely different and did completely different things. And that led, according to Thomas Lacker, to men and women now being seen as wholly different, wholly distinct, the opposite of each other, rather than just kind of different versions of the same thing. And this wasn't just biological, so this wasn't just like they were biologically dissimilar, it was also social. And that's a little bit controversial, but there are these historians called Davidoff and Hall, and they wrote a really famous book called Family Fortunes, where they basically argued that the role of women changed in the 19th century, enclosing women into the domestic sphere, so making them stay at home and do more stuff at home, and kind of limiting their power in public, and letting the public sphere be more the male domain. And they trace this through language and language changing. That's a little bit controversial now because of arguments to do with the extent to which language reflects reality. But we can at least say that language shifted now in the 19th century to consign women to domesticity, or at least praise women for their domesticity and for different, uniquely feminine virtues. Also, while men and women are being thought of as very different socially and biologically, this change is kind of reflected in fashion. Fashion historian Valerie Steele, who is amazing and you should definitely check her out too. Valerie Steele's made the observation, which is maybe a bit obvious, but that in the 19th century, men's fashion became austere and static. The fashions for men didn't really change that much in the 19th century, whereas they had done previously. And women's fashion continued to be really dynamic and really exciting and really expressive. So fashion in itself became feminized, or became seen as feminine, while male hair stayed pretty much the same, like short, pretty simple. Women's hair changed all the time, and so exciting styled hair was seen now as feminine and as kind of a marker of a woman. That's why hair in 19th century British culture is really interesting and exciting and different. But hair hasn't actually been studied that much by historians, which was another reason that I did this dissertation. It has been studied quite a lot by people of different academic fields. So a lot of the study of hair has come from psychoanalysis. A lot of historical studies now draw on psychoanalysis first. That's like one of the starting points, and just kind of accept them as fact. So like accepting Freudian theories about hair being phallic, especially curly hair, and therefore sexual because they look like penises, and then also the Medusa being the archetype of this, and like the Medusa being the starting point for all studies of hair, and then cutting the hair similarly apparently relates to castration, and it's always linked back to Samson in the Bible, and a story about Samson from the Old Testament when his hair was cut off and all his strength was drained because all his strength was found in his hair or connected to his hair. And then also the fetishization of hair has been linked to childhood sexuality and maternal castration complexes. I'm not going to go into any of that, because to me it's like beyond history. It's like kind of meaningless and kind of like just a bit weird, and like what does it matter what it represents to the I just, to my mind, curly hair does not represent the phallus, and lots of people have delved into that, and I didn't in my dissertation, and I'm not going to here either. If you want to look that up, there are plenty of places where you can. And then also anthropology has been pretty important. So there's this anthropologist called Mary Douglas, and her work has been really influential as well. So her 1966 book theorised that marginal sites in the body were infused with a powerful disruptive potential. So bear with me. She said that everything symbolises the body and the body symbolises everything. So when the boundaries of the body are compromised, this freaks people out because it sort of symbolises the compromisation of the boundaries of society and the rules of society. And hair being something which is of the body and yet something that you can mould or cut off, hair's a bit funky, hair's marginal, hair is anomalous, and therefore hair holds disruptive potential and can cause anxiety and be troubling for people because of what it represents. So that's kind of important when we think about like false hair, especially because that's like another step away from like what is and what isn't the body. But also I don't delve into that kind of thing too much either, because this is history and not anthropology. So there's that. And then also there's sociology. So there have been quite a few sociological studies, especially in the 19th century, where people did a study on a very specific culture and then made very generalized, big, overarching statements about what hair represents overall. So in the 1950s, for example, there was this guy called Edmund Leach who went to South Asia and studied hair in South Asia, and then came to the conclusion that loose hair represented unrestrained sexuality and bound or tied up hair represented constrained or restricted sexuality, and then a shaven head represented celibacy, which is like, fine, like you do you, Edmund. But also, these are very overarching, very simplistic generalizations that are not necessarily specific to culture or history, and so it's like not very useful because it's just like, it's very oversimplistic, so I don't really pay any attention to that. And then we come to literary analysis, and that is really interesting because literary analysis, unlike things like sociology and also potentially anthropology, is very historically grounded and has been really important in paving the way for future historical studies about hair. So I used it loads in this dissertation, hence why I used so many like novels and things. And one of the major literary analyses of hair in the 19th century was done by a woman called Elizabeth Gitter, who I mentioned in my last video. It's only 20 pages long, it's a really short analysis, but it's really thorough, really interesting, and it was really important in the study of hair. So she examined the mystical properties of golden hair especially. I mean, she looked at other hair, but it was mainly golden hair that she looked at, because she said it was like this Victorian obsession. Basically in the 19th century, Victorians were obsessed with golden haired beauties, and it represented lots of different things. So she said it represented saintliness and spirituality on the one hand, and then on the other hand sexuality, which was threatening because of Victorian culture and the place that it held in Victorian culture. She said that this literary trope of the golden-haired beauty gained peculiar intensity in the Victorian era, representing both of those things and also a fascination with money. It was kind of linked with like feminine arts of like weaving and sewing, and so she sort of tied it together with lots of different things and talked about hair as like mystical and magical in literature. So that's really interesting, and that is something that I draw on a fair amount in this dissertation. Fashion historians took a little while to catch up. They didn't really tackle hair in any meaningful way by itself for a really long time. So there was this guy called Richard Corson, for example. He wrote a massive book all about hair in 1965. The book traced hair fashions over 5,000 years, and it had a whole chapter dedicated to women's hair in the 19th century, where it went through in painstaking detail all of the fashions of women's hair, decade by decade, year by year, with pictures and descriptions and clippings from newspapers and periodicals, so like magazines. That kind of thing didn't really delve any deeper than just like what hair looked like or what was in fashion, so it like wasn't particularly like deep. It was just very thorough. And other fashion historians like my babe Valerie Steele did like touch on hair, but it was only to like as like minor additions to wider narratives about fashion changing in general. So it's like not enough, in my opinion. And then the 1990s came along, and we have Helen Shoemaker, who, as part of the material turn, which is a historical fancy way of saying a sort of trend for historians looking into materiality and objects as interesting things in history to study. As part of that, Helen Shoemaker looked at hair as objects, and she did an article about hair that had been cut off and so made into locks of hair and then woven into jewellery that were then traded as a commodity. So she talked about sort of the uncommodifiable commodity because it was so deeply personal. It's your hair, and it retained that kind of a selfhood in this lock of hair, and yet it was traded as like a capitalist commodity in a sort of soulless way. And she kind of explored the clashing of those two kind of contradictory things. That's quite a specific topic, so it was like really interesting, but also like not that big of an exploration. Then there's Galia Offek, who I've already mentioned because she wrote a really important book about hair that is, I think to this day, but certainly when I wrote my dissertation, the only single-authored, multidisciplinary, book-length study of hair, the cultural history of hair as well, in the 19th century. So when I found it and I was doing my research for my dissertation, I was kind of like, am I gonna write anything new? Because this was like a really good book, and I really wanted to be original, and she'd done loads of work on hair and produced this really amazing book. So it's really thorough, and I really recommend it if you're interested in this kind of thing. She used loads of sources and lots of different approaches inspired by different things that people had done in previous disciplines to do with hair. But it wasn't a perfect analysis. Hallelujah, praise the Lord. I could still write my little dissertation. So even though she does use multiple approaches, it's still separated, so it doesn't like combine them necessarily. She kind of misses some opportunities for originality. So in some chapters she basically builds on what Goethe says and like what all of the literary people says, and some of the chapters she's like very much taking more of a Freudian approach, more like psychoanalysis, and then other places she's doing other things. So she doesn't necessarily bring it all together. And then also she very much focuses on gender and on sexuality and on fetish. So she kind of misses a lot of really interesting topics that haven't been explored as much. You know, things like class, things like race, things like age. So there are like some holes in what she did, basically. Also in 2019, so the year before I started my research into my dissertation, there was a collection of essays that was published, edited by a historian called Sarah Heaton, and it was all about hair, studied in a cultural way as well, so it was really interesting. Some of the essays were kind of unoriginal, kind of building on previous stuff that had already been said, so like about gender and sexuality and all of that. And some of them were really, really interesting and kind of got me thinking about ways that you can approach studying hair in a historical way for my own work. So they're really, really interesting studies of false hair and of hair care adverts and of magic and class and age and also race, although the race was still limited to like African hair in the Americas. Topics like race are really missing from the historiography of hair. There have been like little studies like that which focus on the hair of a particular people in a particular environment, but largely in like wider narratives, wider studies, different races are not really brought into the conversation. This is a very whitewashed history. I did touch on race a bit in my dissertation, but I can't pretend to do it the justice that it deserves. Like, it really, really needs a lot more study. And then also things like class, I also did touch on, again, not like necessarily enough, but certainly much more proportionally than like other studies, because it's been largely forgotten. Like, a lot of these histories of hair have been building on literary analysis or have been focused on the fashions of the upper classes, so it's very lofty, and the kind of grounded history of the masses is often lost. You know, people focus on like literature rather than the real experience, and I tried to kind of do both, so that's exciting. And then also, really, really interestingly, certain colours of hair have been studied more than others. So golden hair, like I mentioned before, golden or blonde hair has been really, really studied in lots of detail. And black hair has been studied a fair amount too, but brown hair has been largely ignored. I mean, red hair has been studied a little bit, but not so much. And grey hair has been almost entirely forgotten. There are cases in which like it has been studied, and like some of those other colours of hair have been studied. So for example, black hair, people always come back to Eustacia Vi, who's a character in a Thomas Hardy novel called Return of the Native, and grey hair, people always turn back to Miss Havisham in Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So there have been like some analyses of these kind of colours of hair, but mostly a lot of the history of hair comes back to golden hair or blonde hair, which I think is a little bit unfair. Hair texture, like people haven't really studied that very much, except when they're just saying like, oh, loose hair represents this and tied up hair represents, like that's not good enough. No. And also, really, really interestingly, hair is always presented, always posed as something that's sort of transcendent, magical, invincible, when hair, just like every other part of the body, dies, deteriorates, loses value. So that's also something that I really wanted to delve into in this dissertation. What can I say? It's interesting, it's original. I pioneered, I paved the way for new studies. The title of this is A Cultural History of Hair. A cultural history, what does it mean by a cultural history? This dissertation explores ideas and meanings and representations of hair more than what people did or what hair was. It's about the place that women's hair held in the British imagination, what people thought and believed about hair, rather than what people did with their hair. That's why novels and poems and paintings are really, really relevant. How ideas were built and then represented and then passed on. So it's kind of reflecting and also building narratives about hair. And then also articles, adverts and poems in newspapers and magazines kind of gives us more of an idea of what was happening inside the minds of readers, like of everyday people in the 19th century. Okay, albeit kind of skewed towards the middle classes, but it still tells us kind of, or gives us a bit of an idea about how hair was being thought about and discussed in the public sphere. And then I also used texts written by scientific and medical authorities, which was so interesting and so weird, I cannot tell you, because this was a time period when medicine and science, when it comes to hair, was kind of mashed up with like myth and half-truths and like wild speculation. So these kind of texts tried to be really scientific and really helpful, but then also it's just a wild ride. And sometimes kind of gross too. And they're also really important too because snippets from those texts were often re-quoted in articles, in periodicals, so the wider public could read them as well. Like, they weren't just things that were read by medical professionals and scientists. They were very much read and consumed and thought about by the public that just was reading a newspaper or reading a magazine. Yeah, so that's kind of why I did what I did. And it's very exciting. And I can't wait to share it with you in a little bit more depth. But for a little overview of what I'm hoping to explore in these next few videos, I divided my dissertation into 3 chapters, and I don't know how many videos I'm going to divide it into. Maybe it's going to be another 3 and then I conclude. Who knows? I might do it more, I might do fewer, I might not continue this if no one likes it, but the first chapter that I did was called Beautiful Hair. So it was about hair that was prized aesthetically, highly valued, thought of as very beautiful, the ideal. So often that meant gold or blonde hair, usually curly or lusciously long. But then I also talked about really valuable hair, as in hair that was the detached locks of people that were really loved. So it held lots of value as sort of a representation of that loved one, rather than just because it was closer to the aesthetic ideal. And then also I talked about the red hair of the pre-Raphaelites, because that was seen as beautiful but in a sort of slightly different, highly sexual way, which was also seen as kind of dangerous. So it's like a dangerous beauty, which links quite nicely to chapter 2, which was called The Unbeautiful Bad and the Ugly. Yes, I know, I'm very cool. With that, we start off by exploring modest hair. So if the pre-Raphaelites and red hair was seen as like dangerous beauty, modest hair was like protecting yourself from that danger. Modest hair was safe, or at least that's how it was viewed. And then black hair was seen as connected to an imagined primitive past, which is so interesting and so problematic on so many levels. Then also false hair is something we dive into as polluting and kind of disgusting and really interesting. And then also in institutions, hair was often forcibly cut off or shaven in order to uglify women and kind of strip them of their identities and their dignity and their beauty. So that's really interesting, and I touched on that sadly quite briefly. Yeah, so in that chapter there's quite a lot of stuff about like power and power dynamics and what hair meant in those kind of terms. In chapter 3, that was all about the deterioration of hair, so aging hair, balding hair, thinning hair, greying hair, and then also as locks, hair that could potentially lose its value depending on a deteriorating relationship that it represented. If a lock of hair that represented someone you really loved was really beautiful and really powerful and really wonderful, then if that relationship kind of died and deteriorated, then what happened then to that lock of hair that was previously seen as so beautiful and so wonderful? My overall argument then was that hair was saturated with so much meaning. It was so powerful and so interesting in the 19th century. Whether a woman was beautiful or ugly or dying, powerful or powerless, her hair was intimated in a web of cultural representations that viewed a person's hair as an external representation of their internal self, a window into their soul. And that's why it's so interesting. And that's why I had so much fun with this. It gets a bit disgusting, it gets a bit gruesome at times. It also gets very pretty and so charming. Like some of the stories that I read and some of the poems, some of them really sad. I kind of go into love and sexuality and death and beauty and art and medicine as well. Like, I found it so interesting. Let me know if you think it would be interesting too, and I'm gonna make these videos. I'll be honest, I might make them anyway, because I find it really interesting and I love my dissertation so much and I just want to talk about it for hours and hours and hours. So look out for a video on beautiful hair, and thanks for watching this one. Okie dokie. See you in the next one, and goodbye. Hi! It's Hattie! Absolute nonsense. No, I didn't. That's rubbish. I can put Cambridge in the title of all these videos, so maybe you'll like me still. Yikes. Blah, blah, blah. I was going where no man had gone before. This is a lie. I did some interesting stuff, and I'm proud of it, and I'm tooting my own horn, and to be honest, as a British woman in a patriarchal society, this feels uncomfortable on many levels. But I'm proud of myself, and I'm gonna carry on. Even though to myself it sounds very arrogant, but this is what I did, okay? I did it, and I'm pleased with it, so I'm gonna carry on talking. Bye!